It's time for Truth, a ministry of Truth Family Bible Church in Middleton, Idaho. It's Time for Truth exists to glorify God through the edification of His saints in our local church and for the benefit of the church around the world. I'm your host, Pastor Danny Steinmeier. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you once again for joining us today on another exciting episode of the podcast. I am here with my regular sidekick, Pastor Gabe of Stone Mountain Baptist Church in Nampa, Idaho, and welcome once again to the podcast.
I will accept the term sidekick.
Sidekick.
I suppose I'll take it.
You can call me Kimosabi.
Or something. Batman and Robin? I don't know.
Something like that. Well, we've been having a good time together and enjoying this format and this medium of media to get our content out to you, to share what we think, and hopefully it is edifying and strengthening to you all. And so grateful to you for listening. And so wherever you may be, thanks for listening. And also would love to have you share this around, give some others an opportunity to interact with our content. Welcome to all of you newer viewers and listeners on YouTube. Glad to have you as we are part of the Truth Script family. And so we have a new Truth Script YouTube podcast. And so grateful for all of you who have joined us. Well, today's an interesting episode. We're taking a little bit of excursion away from our regularly scheduled programming, which is 1689 London Baptist Confession of Faith. We're going to talk current events, which is not out of the ordinary for us. We're going to talk about things related to politics, which is on the menu for every good and faithful pastor as well.
Political theology is a need.
It's very much needed, and if your church or pastor is saying that we should not or the pastor shouldn't be political or anything like that, while there may be some appropriate or inappropriate things related to the Sunday sermon, generally speaking, you ought to be applying the Scripture to every area of life. There is not one subject that is off limits to the Lordship of Christ and to the principles and values and truths and commands of Scripture. And so we want to apply in a way that we can honor Christ in everything that we do. And so politics is part of that. Politics is really just the ordering of civil society around a body of beliefs, of values, and of laws. And laws, of course, are things that the Bible has a lot to talk about, right?
Well, it's because laws are moral, right? So at the end of the day, if we're going to be Christians talking about what it means to live in a civil society, we're going to be seeking to impose the biblical morality upon the society. And ultimately, it's because that's what our society was founded upon. And so it's impossible to avoid the Bible when you're talking about society because it's built on a basis of culture and worship.
Right. And we learned, especially a number of years ago, that marriage is political.
Yeah.
Right? It weighs into, or politics weighs into these things. And so, of course, we have things to say, but not just about, marriage, but of every area of life. We have reason to address these things from a biblical point of view. And so that's our aim today. Our subject, if you've clicked on it by also looking at the title of the episode, you'll understand and realize that we're going to be talking about the issue of immigration, a very hot button topic today and a very important one. We are in the beginning, the immediacy of the new Trump administration. And I can't help but say, pretty happy so far. It's been a good couple of weeks. Happy to see a number of elements, and actually, it's great to see actually an element of boldness, of not being politically correct and apologetic for doing what he said he was going to do and what the people desire him to do, and also we need to evaluate certain elements as to whether or not they're good and right things, but not everything he does, or just because he does it doesn't make it right. Yeah. But we want to just appreciate and recognize that God has given us a significant reprieve in the Trump administration. And so we don't want to squander that. We want to build upon it. We want to call our nation and our people and our families to repent and to follow Christ, because we are not getting what we deserve. We are getting what we don't deserve. There is a mercy here, but we also want to do better than that. We actually want to overtly confess the Lord Jesus Christ as a nation. And so we need to continue to push this agenda down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously we can recognize that, as a constitutional republic, the way our government is supposed to operate is not supposed to be a slurry of executive orders. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to be negative here and blackpilling on the idea of him doing it, because frankly, we're so foregone a culture that could survive our government without it. That I'm appreciating at least him pushing the Overton window by him making bold declarations, whether someone else wrote them or not, and they're his ideas. I don't care. He signed them. He promoted them. He's still pushing some very important narratives to the forefront. At the end of the day, whether or not they end up having binding legal force or not, he's directing. He's giving a direction, and he's giving an ultimatum to the legislators that are going to have to respond. So obviously what I'd like to see is the vast majority of those executive orders enshrined in law properly through the legislature. Let's legislate that there is only two genders. Let's do that. I don't think we should have to, but if we must, let's do it. So I do want to obviously acknowledge that we're in kind of a weird point in American history where we have this back and forth. I can recognize that if Harris was in the office right now, I'd be kind of scared to think of what executive orders she'd be passing. But at the end of the day, she's not. God sovereignly, providentially put Trump in the White House. We're having these orders come across. And so, yeah, I agree 100%. I believe that God has given us a window of opportunity now as Christians to be faithful, to prophetically speak the truth. And I really think we're seeing, the kids call it a vibe shift. I'm just going to say that we're seeing the Overton window shift, right? The acceptable rhetoric within the civil sphere right now compared to 4 years ago is night and day different. And if you don't think that's the hand of God providentially working to give us this opportunity to be faithful now, just read the scripture a little bit more and come back. So I'm excited for the opportunity. It gives us some serious things to look at. And obviously, the immigration topic is definitely front of mind for a lot of people right now. So hopefully this will be a good conversation to really help keep people on the straight and narrow.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of bad takes this last week. A couple of them, decrying all of these executive orders and so forth, and acting like he's acting like a king or a dictator or something like that. I'm like, well, first of all, there's nothing wrong with a king.
We could use a king, right?
Sometimes you have to lead even when the rest of the people won't do their job, and ultimately it's a matter of whether or not you're a good king or a bad king. That's all. Mm-hmm. That's really what it comes down to. Yes, what you said was spot on. Yes, we are supposed to have the legislature do their job.
But they're not.
They're not. The president can truly only go so far, and it may be very short-lived, which is why we need to do better, and also identify what comes after Trump. But
JD Vance. But what comes after.
But
Trump.
for now, we'll enjoy it, and we'll take the opportunity. Mm-hmm. But right now, I think it's a time for just relief. Yep. The sun's a little brighter, and we're a little bit happier with what we're seeing, and I'm for it, man.
Yeah. I've just been pointing to the parable of the talents. When I talk to the men of my church, I've just been reminding them, hey, let's make sure we don't go bury the talent in the dirt and wait. Let's make sure we're investing it, growing it, and advancing the kingdom. Because I feel like we've been given a great opportunity to now push it. The rhetoric that we're seeing, even in the conversation we've had with Brandon recently with regards to his bill of equal protection, just the fact that conversation is happening all over the country right now wouldn't have been a thing 15 years ago. So God has really done some amazing work over the past couple of decades in shaping and growing young men who are now in a position of leadership and authority to advance that. And our job now is to take that ball and keep moving it down the field. And I feel like God has really orchestrated that. So no, I'm thankful. Let's use the opportunity and keep it going.
Well, that sounds good. Well, let's talk about one of the big issues that Trump ran on and that he is starting to deliver on, and that's the issue of immigration. There's been a lot of actions already, which sort of was surprising to me, actually, because it turns out they knew where a lot of these guys were. They knew,
like registries.
Well, I think a lot of them had already been convicted, right? And so then they were either out on parole or whatever they were at. They actually went after them in neighborhoods and different things like that. And I just think thought it'd be valuable for us to just talk about that a little bit. What do we think about the issue of immigrant? Well, maybe we should step back. Do you want to start at the nation's side? I mean, let's talk first about.
Can't really talk about immigration if you don't know what you're immigrating to, right?
Let's do that first. When it comes to a nation, well, what is a nation? And when we're talking about borders, are those things legitimate? Is there something to be said for we're just citizens of the world. We're all God's creatures. We shouldn't have, it's actually nations that go to war against other nations, but if we all just kind of get along, we all just kind of can cross over the borders whenever we want. Is that the ideal? Is that what we want? Or are borders meaningful? Are nations a meaningful concept? So maybe we start with the idea of, well, what is a nation to begin with? And then we'll get into the values of a nation from there. What would say, how would you answer the question, what is a nation?
So a nation is going to be a people that have a common language, common culture. So common worship is a huge foundation for that. The geographic border thing obviously can be flexible depending on time and how history pans out. A lot of us, because of recency bias, don't realize how much the borders in Europe, for example, have changed over the last 500 years. So for us, it seems like a big deal. But if you look at all of human history, borders change all the time. So, but a general geographic region, common heritage, the fact that we can point back and say, hey, this piece of dirt here is our family farm, and it's been our family farm for generations. That common heritage is a huge part. But yeah, I'd say, language and worship and sort of common ancestry obviously are kind of the big things. But how that formulates itself out, I think is through, governance and coming together as a society civilly as well. So when we start talking about immigration and borders, we're thinking in the modern civic sense. And so we're looking at, okay, this is a country that has come together civilly for their own protection, for their own good. So at that point, you're looking at protecting your borders, protecting your culture, protecting your people, ultimately. Feel free to add to that.
Well, I think for me, I think it's been an important one recently as I've been preaching through the book of Exodus and seeing how God formed Israel as a nation. Now, of course, nations predate the people of Israel. Obviously, they came out of a nation in the nation of Egypt. But the idea of the formation of a nation, I think, was very valuable to see that in the scripture, where you have a large group of people. They're really just a giant family that's had a baby boom for 400 years,
like most of our churches right now,
right? And so they've ballooned in size, living within another country, a little kind of corner or part of a country, and so they've become and actually it's interesting how they were seen as a threat, right? They actually weren't assimilating super well with the Egyptians. That's a good thing. They assimilated a little too much, right? They certainly wanted, their hearts were still often with Egypt. Yeah. We see that as a problem and being a part of Israel. But we'll come back to this idea a little bit, but this idea of here's a nation within a nation. Yeah. Here's a people group that is different and distinct with a different God, a different culture, a number of different elements. And ultimately what happened there is you have the Egyptians as a nation having the authority enslaving a different people. That wasn't a good arrangement for a number of reasons. But you've got there is a natural conflict within.
You could almost argue though that was born out of sort of the forced multiculturalism, right? The fact that you have a nation within a nation, the fact that it turned to the slavery dynamic. Really shouldn't shock anyone, given the fact that when you have someone who ultimately has very different values and worship and is a different people, is going to be perceived as an antagonistic threat at some point.
Sure, of course, not understanding certain elements of history, right? Forgetting Joseph, and not knowing what Joseph did to actually contribute to the well-being of Egypt as a whole, as well as the whole region. But anyway, so you've got God now entering the picture, hearing the cries of the enslaved people of Israel. And so they're not really a nation yet. They're just a large family, large group of people. And God calls them out of Egypt. And just before, really, as they're leaving, God starts off with, I'm changing your culture. Okay, you are going to be my people. And so what he does is that he starts with the calendar, and he changes the calendar so they're not going to run on the Egyptian calendar. The Jewish people are going to have their own calendar, starting with this moment of redemption. So they start the year with salvation and the celebration of God and what He did for His people, and so the calendar, which by the way was Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's how the calendar starts. And when you think about it, we'll pause here for a moment and just kind of reflect on our own nation for a moment. What has a particular group of people we'll call them leftists. What have they've had allies and people that and useful idiots to help them, but what have they been doing, and what did President Obama say that he was doing to our country, radically transforming the country? And what was one of those?
Hijacking the calendar.
You hijack the calendar.
You subvert every Christian value and replace it with a leftist holiday.
You change the calendar as a way of shaping culture.
Yep.
You are pointing to different values, different
These are
gods.
the heroes to worship. These are the people to look up to. This is the values we want to imbue in our people.
And when you do that within a country that you are living in, you are actually rebelling against it, and you're actually tearing it apart. And so when you've got Pride Month, that's not an accident that they wanted a piece of the calendar. That is part of tearing apart the fabric of a country that would have never tolerated such a thing. It's an imposition. It's a civil war move. Okay,
Yeah.
when you take the calendar. Now, God was taking Israel not as an act of civil war, but as an act of we're leaving, of exodus. We actually are leaving and becoming our own nation. And so God gives them a calendar. He then gives them a new work week wherein he establishes for them cultural order, which identifies their work in a particular period of time, God's provision for them with worship and rest. And so then you go from there to they develop a military. Well, they didn't have a military because they didn't fight their way out of Exodus,
Right.
Out of Egypt. And so they're attacked from behind, and which means which was a terrorist attack on the women, the children, the hospitals,
the ones at the back.
the
Yeah,
slow,
yeah.
right? The slowest of the group. They're at the back, and so they were attacked in an unprovoked manner from old grudges and old family feuds, and they were attacked from behind. And so then Israel needs to defend themselves, and so they muster the men together and they develop a fighting force. They develop a military. You go from the military to Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. He comes and says, "Hey, wait a minute! This whole system is not working quite well.
Can't have one judge.
You can't have one judge over everything. You need a plurality of judges. You need lower courts and higher courts. You can still be the Supreme Court justice, Moses, but you need other qualified, capable men, godly men, who are able to make decisions and adjudicate matters." You go from there. So you have a court system. Then you have your laws. So then you have your Constitution, which is the Ten Commandments. And you have the case law, the civil law. You've got your priestly laws, your ceremonial laws. What does this sound like?
That's a nation.
It's a nation. It's a nation, right? So you have a people that is ordered around a common culture, common families.
Yep.
Right, where they've been together, obviously for 400 years, even developing their own family. Then you've got God, religion, you've got culture, you've got families, and then ultimately they're being led to a land.
Yeah, and those families, you made a point earlier when we were talking. Those families aren't just from one line only, right? So there is.
Correct.
You do have some people that have maybe come from other tribes within Egypt. Obviously. You even look at Pharaoh or Joseph himself and sort of the lineage there. So you have different peoples, but they are all one people ultimately because they have that common heritage, that common culture and worship and tongue. So it's not to say exclusively. We can talk more about ethnicity and stuff probably down the road a little bit, but it's not to say exclusively that your ethnos is purely your genetic makeup and your history, racially speaking. That also has to do with your common heritage, what you've been assimilated into, and ultimately what your trajectory is as a family, right? That's a huge part of it.
Well, that's right. And so it's not about the color of your skin. Ultimately, you find this throughout Israel's history. You have the welcoming of aliens and strangers into the country and how they were to be treated and how they were to respect the laws of Israel. So
they were circumcised.
For instance, you didn't get to come in. So if you're an outsider, you're from a different country, but you're going to come and do some trade, you're going to do conduct business. You come into Israel and you're actually, you don't get to open up shop on Saturday.
Yeah.
You don't get to do that. Why? Because that's not the way just because you get to do that in your place doesn't mean you get to do that here, because that's against the law here. And so you are going to abide by the laws of the country you are visiting. And furthermore, then you have the proselytes, right? Then you have the outsiders who actually say, I want your people to be my people, right? You've got Ruth,
Yeah.
and then you've got Rahab, as for instances, where you have people come into the nation, and you have people that want to say, you know what, I want to be part of this nation and this community, and your God should be my God. That was welcomed and was part of the ministry of Israel, to be a light to the nations, that they would
To the Gentiles.
to the Gentiles, so that people would be drawn to them. And so you've got a number of these different things where the identity of the nation, though, is centered on who they are as a people, who it is they worship, and the culture that's built around that culture, of course, being the outflow of their faith, of what they believe, of their religion. But you see that it's very, there is a centrality and an identity of a people that then, like you said earlier, I think it was very helpful, that there is a land involved. There's a place involved. You have to have a place for the
Common
people.
tongue, common land, common place, right?
You brought up common tongue. That's such an important element, right? That we speak one language, because it's otherwise you have chaos and confusion. You've got
That
division.
goes all the way back to Babel, right? So one way of looking at it is that when God dispersed the languages and confused the languages, in some ways that was the establishment, sort of the proto-establishment of nations, right? Because you have this recognition that as the languages went forth, now you have tribes. Well, what are tribes? Tribes are just sort of mini nations, really, if you think about it. And what we think of as nations, modern day speaking, is sort of the joining of tribes together in sort of mutual benefit, right? We even see that within Israel. So you've got multiple tribes within Israel, but they're all of the same worship, right? They worship the same God, and so those tribes can unite together ultimately. Now, we see even splitting, obviously, with Judah and Israel. Even when you have common lineage, same God you're worshiping, even when you have all those things, common tongue, you can still have civil war and split. So there's a lot of interesting things that come from that. But if you take out that language aspect, it's impossible to form a nation with someone that doesn't understand you. So it's a pretty core component.
Yeah, not that you can't speak multiple languages. The issue is that there is a common language that unites you. And so I would be one who would reject this propositional nation idea that the nation or really
so
we're
should
probably,
English be our official language? Good.
Oh, that's an old discussion, but absolutely, right?
Yeah, the fact that it's not answered yet is what's crazy.
It's what's ridiculous. but it's this element of, our country is an idea, not a people.
Yeah, or we're an economic zone, right?
We're just an economic zone. So
what does that even mean to say that our nation is an idea? That is simply, I think, a bait and switch to say, look over here, don't pay attention to all the problems that are going to come with this ideology.
Well, it sounds appealing, but it sounds appealing to us now because we've already drunk deeply of the poisonous well of multiculturalism. Yeah. And so let's just start there, because then that really is going to get us into the issue, or not just start there. We already started somewhere else at the issue of a nation. I think we've established that fairly well. I think we recognize that it's really about a people with things in common centered around who they worship and the culture they share together, with a common language and history, with then borders of a particular land. And if you don't have borders, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. If you don't have borders, then you're going to struggle to remain in existence as a people. But let's get to this multiculturalism thing, because
it's a blessing, right?
No, actually,
No, okay.
Actually, no.
Oh, okay. Evangelicals, hardest hit. Let's go.
All right. This whole business. Look, it's so funny that we're having these conversations.
Define culture, though, right? Like, why is it when you hear multiculturalism, we're not talking about going and eating out at 16 different ethnic food places, okay? So obviously, I can say there is a blessing in enjoying tacos and Chinese food, right? That's not what we're talking about. When you're talking about multiculturalism, you are talking about multiple systems of life, multiple worship systems, so multiple gods being worshipped, coinciding or cohabitating within the same borders. And that's a very different thing. I think we've been, again, you talk about poisoning. We've just been trained to think that multiculturalism is, we're all the same. We just eat different foods and speak different languages, but we're really all just the same. We're all just the Imago Dei, yes and amen. Of course we are. But that doesn't mean that we don't actually have distinctions that do set us apart. If you have someone who literally worships a demon who wants to kill you, that's a problem if you're trying to live across the street from each other. All we have to do is look at Europe to see that, right? So I just, if you could, define why is the culture why is that hard with regards to the cohabitating, right?
Well, I'll bring it back. Yeah, I'll bring it back to the biblical idea that God identified with Israel is that you are not to intermarry with the other nations because of the influence that would have upon you in a diluting and in a paganizing of your own culture. And so, especially if you are fighting for a godly culture, right? If you're seeking to have true worship and obedience, and which is, of course, the ultimate of human flourishing is to honor the Lord and to follow His ways in His through His Word, through obedience to Him. The problem is that if you intermarry, and we'll use it in the immigration idea as well. If you invite all of these competing worldviews into your nation, that affects voting.
Absolutely.
It affects economics. It affects worship. It affects laws, right? So if you are going to establish laws centered around the Lord's Day and the Christian Sabbath, as a for instance, which our nation did begin with, when you have those types of laws, you've got a bunch of people who are not going to who aren't assimilated with that, who aren't here because I want to be Christian like you. It's I'm here, but I'm going to keep my my little Chinatown or my little Italy, all these other little elements where, again, not against the ideas of certain elements of food and so forth, but the idea is we're not on the same page culturally. We're trying to keep the culture from somewhere else, take the culture from somewhere else, and have my own group within the larger nation. And I think that's ultimately a diluting influence that has a negative effect.
And that's not to say that there wasn't, certain, like take it back to the colonies, right? Different states had different European heritage, right? They might have a predominantly Dutch population or predominantly English population. Right. And so that played itself out at the state level. And so part of this discussion, we can pivot into, I think, as we move towards immigration is, so what then is an American, right? What then is the American culture, and what is it that we're defending against? Because ultimately what we're going to have to talk about with immigration is that we're trying to protect our nation, protect our culture, protect, ultimately protect our national identity against sort of this paganizing influence of multiculturalism. So when you think about that, it's not necessarily that we might not have certain heritages that we have in common. That's not necessarily the problem. It's whether or not those heritages are fully assimilated into a new American heritage.
You need to actually love your own nation.
Amen.
Love your own people. So it doesn't mean that you can't have some measure of affection and affinity for where you've come from, for your ancestry, to trace your heritage back to somewhere in Europe or somewhere in Africa or somewhere in South America. Nothing particularly wrong with that, and having some measure of pride in that aspect as well. But it's this element of it's happening for a long time, right? You go to an American sporting event and they're going to wave the Mexican flag. Yeah. It's like, wait a minute, what are you doing here? Like, you should be cheering for our team. Now, I don't have a problem with you recognizing yourself as having come from Mexico, but are you one who actually is here to love this country and to love your neighbors and to be part of, not be based on skin color, but based on the fact that you care about the values of this country.
Right. Yeah. It's that concept of rightly ordered affections. There's nothing wrong. I've got a German, Scandinavian, and sort of British heritage. I'm very European, right? That's fine. I appreciate that. I was an exchange student in Germany. I speak the language, so I have that aspect of my history. But I'm an American. I'm not a European. Thank you, God. I'm not a European, and so for that reason, I can appreciate my heritage. But that's multiple generations ago, which again leads us kind of into this conversation of, so what is it that our nation's culture was founded upon? So what was the initial American culture? And so we can look at maybe what it's become and why immigration has been such a hot topic with regards to that.
Well, yeah, you've got the founding certainly related to the recognition of God and what He has done providentially in bringing together. You think about the Pilgrims, you think about the original colonies, and the acknowledgement of God, and so you've got that. Stepping back for just a second, one of the things that we've noticed, over the years. I think we noticed it with, I think it was a friend of my wife's. she has, Dutch heritage. And when it came time for the Olympic Games, even though she is born, raised, probably several generations in the United States, she was able to, she was recruited to play for the Dutch national team. The sort of blurring, this happens all the time in the United States. We actually are competing against our own people when they are running or competing or swimming or whatever it is for other countries, even though they've born and raised on American soil, they've gone to American universities, they've been trained athletically and every other way, and yet maybe they couldn't make the U.S. team, but because they have a certain measure of blood and heritage, they actually will compete on the world scale against their own people.
It's kind of crazy.
That sort of bizarreness, that's been bizarre. But getting back to your question, this issue of what our nation is founded on. Doug Wilson has pointed out this multiple times. I forget the Supreme Court case in the 1800s, recognizing it was automatic. You ask anybody, and even ask probably most of the world today, what kind of a nation is the United States of America? We are a Christian nation. We were founded as a Christian nation. As a Christian nation,
and uniquely a Protestant Christian nation, I think is worth pointing out. While there was Catholics, you had Maryland.
Well, there was a lot of conflicts, yes, with the Catholics, because you've got a lot of long-standing differences and animosities, right? But there is a different. There are different standards, obviously, and you become beholden to other. One of the challenges with that, right, is that the Catholics have an authority that is somewhere else that is then imposed over here, right? So there's the Protestant elements have a little bit more of an independence and could be more regionally independent,
correct,
as well. So you've got a number of those different issues. But we were founded as a Christian nation. The multicultural effort is not against the fact. I mean, obviously, we're a nation that was founded by people that came from other places, immigrants.
Sure.
And that's been that way for a long time. But there is a sense, though, of our identity, which is found in our laws, which is found in God, and those types of, and in like you said, the Protestant. Which,
I mean, we were primarily a European colony, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's just indisputable. Primarily British, Dutch, some Spanish and Portuguese. And French, but I mean, ultimately, tons of Germans actually as well, which is interesting. Even though there wasn't really officially like German colonies, so to speak, heavily Germanic. If you look at the sort of the population density, especially in the early, 17, 1800s. But yes, I mean, we have a common heritage there of. Really, our nation was birthed out of the Reformation. You can trace this back to not only the Pilgrims, but the Puritans, that strain, but you also can look at even just the political thought of Samuel Rutherford with the Presbyterians, and sort of even the founding of our nation wouldn't have occurred, I guess is what I'm saying, if there wasn't Reformation thought.
That's right.
As part of the pulse of America. We never would have stood up.
Yes, and even it's remarkable even how much today we still bask in the afterglow of the Protestant Reformation. But absolutely, that was the worldview that had been that had won the day in the Christian world. And so you have this element of the founding of our country, the basis of our laws. So many elements are drawn from the Scripture, and so I always have had issue with certain evangelicals who will try to argue, we've never been a Christian nation. Like we were never, our founders weren't Christians. Our laws are not Christian.
This is patently false.
It's just actually ridiculous. And
I mean, our case law is built literally upon what Deuteronomy, I think, is the most cited work in like all of our early documents as a nation.
Well, it goes back to this issue of, well, if the people aren't truly saved, you can't pull up the back of their shirt and see the E stamped on their back for elect, right? then of course certain people make the judgments of other people as to whether or not they were saved based on a limited amount of their of their writings and so forth. What you have is you can't be a Christian nation if they're not all saved. And it goes back to other discussions we've had of, well, can you have a Christian family?
Yeah, there's
can
no
you
true
have a Christian
Scotsman.
church?
There's no such thing as a true Scotsman. There's no truly elect. There's no
right.
You constantly are going to up the game as to who the real.
Well, you can't even have a Christian church because not everybody in the church is a genuine Christian. You can't have a Christian school, a Christian business, those types of things. So it's just foolish. Obviously, the foundations of our nation were established on Christian principles.
Yeah,
And they used,
recognizing that some of those guys weren't Christian. That's fine. Yeah.
yeah, of course, but they actually were living they were breathing the Christian air
Yeah.
of a worldview that had come to dominate the Christianizing, the Christendom of the past. And so they worked within it, and even when they acknowledged that they weren't actually a particular convert or whatever, they acknowledged God, and they acknowledged the system that believed in God.
Yeah, you think of the
and
Ben
they saw it as good.
Franklins and the Thomas Jeffersons, those kind of guys. They're still acknowledging. I mean, you read some of Ben Franklin's prayers, and I frankly don't think he was saved. But you read his prayers and some of the things. I mean, he's urging for prayer at the Continental Congress and different things, and it's incredibly profound. Why? Because even if they weren't genuinely saved or had proper theology, they recognize the existence of the Almighty. You know, they might have been agnostic at some level, but they recognized there was a power above them.
And yes, and they yielded to it, and they valued it, and saw that this was the best of that man had to offer in terms of an allegiance to God, as opposed to the Muslim version of things, right?
Certainly.
So they had a much more keen understanding of that, or the native savages and their.
Am I hearing you say, though, that you would prefer cultural Christianity to the multiculturalism we have today?
100%.
Yeah, no joke. One of the most profound moments I had was in my seminary training. Dr. Michael Heiken was my historical theology head, and I was taking his class on the patristics, and he made an argument that Constantine, one, was genuinely saved, and two, that he actually did so much good for the world. Because I grew up sort of Bible college and just teaching like cultural, we never had nominal Christians until Constantine, and how bad that was for the church and for church.
Yeah.
It would have been better if we stayed martyrs forever, because at least everyone would have been genuinely saved.
Everybody loves purity
Yeah.
when they're not being persecuted.
and that was what I imbibed. And so I remember listening to Dr. Haken, and he's like, that's stupid, right? That's silly. And so when you extrapolate that out, I mean, yeah, we can think of 1950s America, even 1940s America, and yeah, most people, they might be hypocrites, right? They're going to church on Sundays and then living these other lives. But my goodness, we had common values, we had safety, we had low crime, we had all these different things, and also people's behinds were in the pews on Sundays hearing the gospel, and so the gospel was getting out.
To.
Exactly, there was something wrong with you if you used. I mean, what's the most common swear word outside of probably the F-bomb in our society? People take the Lord's name in vain constantly in our society today. That would never have been allowed on a average street in our country. So yeah, I mean, when you've got profound atheists, very prominent atheists saying that I think I'm a cultural Christian, what does that tell you? God actually uses that as a good. And so I think we need to move away from this weird pietistic withdrawing of we'd rather all be living in a cave as martyrs than actually having any sense of authority to shape our culture. Do I love my neighbor enough to want them to live in a Christian culture? Even the unbelievers. Yeah, I want even the unbelievers to live in the fruit and the beauty of a Christian culture, so that I can minister to them and bring the gospel to them in a safe way, in a way that'll actually bring more light to the gospel. So yeah, I think it's a weird thing we need to repent of as the church, of thinking that somehow if Christianity is prominent, that's a bad thing.
No, we've got a lot of evangelical idiots right now, and it's been that way for a while. And it goes back to even when I was in college at a Christian university, and there was a number of, this certainly wasn't everybody, and definitely not all the leadership, but you had this element of this desire, this pietistic kind of and quasi-charismatic desire for purity, and purity comes by way of persecution. And so do we even want a Christian nation, right? That's what you were just getting at.
Exactly.
Because actually, if we were persecuted, then the church would be pure, and don't we all just want purity? And I've even back then I had a big problem with it, because I'm like, even though not that I've had it close to me or close to anyone in my family, but I think it's very easy for people to talk like that when their family, when their relatives aren't being raped in front of their faces.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
when your family isn't being arrested and beaten and murdered,
to let the people in London
tortured,
right now, my goodness.
But here's some evangelical college kids talking about how the persecution is good. Look, the Lord is sovereign, and He uses persecution for good purposes. Persecution is not good.
Amen.
And the reality is that you do want cultural Christianity. even if people aren't all saved. You want everybody to be saved. But the idea is that right is right, regardless of whether or not everybody is actually saved in the heart.
Well, I'll just go ahead and take this to the most controversial place I can. Look at Africa. The nations that were Christianized and adopted more of the Anglo-Protestant Christian worldview.
They're poor because they're not Christians.
Yeah. The ones that aren't Christian, exactly. They're still, it's night and day in Africa when you compare the nations that actually had a Christian heritage to the ones that don't. There's no competition, friends.
So a number of years ago, a missionary report came back from some missionaries at our church at the time. And one of the things that was eye-opening and in some ways to them and a little bit to me as a reminder was they go over there to do some mission work, a mission project. And one of the things that that turns out that some of these African men don't have is what's called a Protestant work ethic, right? They actually, it's remarkable, right? They didn't have a concept of work and dependability sure. and regularity and consistency and all these types of things. And so it was very difficult for these missionaries, right? Here they are, they establish a means of helping them to provide for themselves.
I seem to recall BLM making a similar argument. Anyway, keep going.
Practically living out the literal teaching them how to fish. Right, not just handing them a fish, but teaching them how to fish, and then walking away and watching the whole thing just kind of fall apart because they didn't know how to work. They didn't have the concept of a Protestant work ethic. It wasn't part of their culture,
right?
Which is what founded our country, which is in the Protestant worldview, which is Protestant work
biblically,
ethic.
Ultimately, right? I mean, we see 6 days you shall labor. And then on the seventh rest.
Oh, and so many more things, right? All those other doing your work heartily unto the Lord, and all these different things.
Even just the civil codes,
providing for your own household. All the civil
There's
codes.
an expectation of caring for your neighbor, right?
And that's what it means to be a Christian nation, right? You have Christian values. Now, there's a lot of good, hardworking, Protestant work ethic people who couldn't spell Protestant.
Right, sure.
Right, that don't know anything about Christ, that aren't saved at all. They're fully pagan. But you know what? We benefit even from the plumber that you call to come to your house who isn't a Christian, but he's a really good worker.
Yep.
A lot of that comes from the cultural ethos. It comes from the way in which they're raised and the values that they get. And even if they don't know why they have all those values still benefit them and they benefit everyone else around.
Well, and just a quick note on that, since we're talking about work ethic. So take a culture like Japan or sort of the Chinese tiger mom, ideology. You think to yourself, well, they don't really have a Christian heritage, but they're really hard workers. Yeah, but they're really hard workers in an idolatrous sense. Their work actually becomes their idol. And so when you do look at cultures that are hardworking, if they aren't based on a Christian worldview or based on a biblical understanding of who the right God is, what you see is that work ethic actually becomes an abuse to the society and it becomes something that becomes worshipped itself. And so just to clarify there, it's not that you're saying like the only people that work hard in the world are of Christian heritage. No, but the only ones that can do it joyfully, righteously, and unto the Lord are of Christian heritage. And that means something. And for us as Americans, for us to have any definition of America that does not imbue that and embody that set of values, it's a false definition of American, right?
Well, yeah, and it goes back, I was specifically referring to Africa, but you make a good point. But the idea there is that a lot of their problems are traced back to their, again, the values of the religions. It's the worship of their demons have kept them poor, right? Other demons have their people be more rich, but it's a different element, and they've got different
They're
problems.
enslaved to different gods.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. So we've got this issue of culture and a people. These people then have a place, and in order to maintain a culture and a people, you actually have to protect yourselves. You actually have to defend yourselves literally by way of your safety, by way of maintaining life, but you also are needing to maintain your identity as a people because you need values that actually are worth fighting for. You actually have to have neighbors that you love, that you care about. We'll get to that probably in a little bit. But this issue of borders, let's talk about borders for a minute. Is it wrong for a nation to have borders? I mean, there was some talk a number of years ago. I think it was during the Obama administration. More of the talk, especially among evangelicals, right? The idea of open borders, wherein you could just simply cross over, just as being a global citizen, and you could just it didn't really matter. What do you think about that idea? Does that sound like a good idea?
Well, let me ask you a question, and I think it'll drive my opinion home real quick. Do you lock your door in your house?
That's not a good question for me.
Well, okay.
Yes. We'll pretend.
Well, okay.
We'll pretend.
Maybe you don't lock your door, but let me ask you this: did you just let anyone come?
I
into
do
your house?
now.
Yeah. Okay. I feel like there's a story here, but the point being is, do you just let anyone come willy nilly in and out of your home anytime you want because your home is their home and their home is your home?
Of course not. My home has borders.
Yeah, your home has borders. Why?
My property has borders.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. Right. Not just my house, but my land.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay. So, what is a nation? Here's another definition for us, everyone. A nation is a collection of households. Well, what is a household? A household is a little mini nation, right, unto itself, with the husband as the Lord ruling over his land, right? Which is why you need to abolish the property tax. If you're listening in the state of Idaho, do it.
That's right.
But right, we want to actually own our land. But so if you think about that, to answer your question, we need borders to protect our loved ones, right? If I don't love my family, sure, anyone can just come in my house whenever they want and do whatever they want. Like that is actually hatred towards my closest neighbors, my wife and my children. And so just take that now to the city. Does the city have a right to have governing authority within a certain distance? Yeah, okay. We've all gotten this collection of households together. We're going to form a city. Now we have city governance where our jurisdiction, if you will, is within these certain borders. Now we have state borders, and extrapolate that out to ultimately the nation, and whether or not you're of the persuasion, like I am, that we should be saying the United States are rather than the United States is. Regardless, we are a united states, and so when you look at that, absolutely we need to defend the borders because we need to protect our people and our neighbors. It's all about obeying the commandment to love our neighbor.
Right, and that neighbor goes out from nearest to farthest,
right?
In that order, right? So you love your family more specifically, and in a very special way, than as opposed to the way in which or the amount to which you give your love to other people. It doesn't mean you hate them,
sure,
but there is an order. There's an order in which we demonstrate our loves, and so it starts with your closest neighbors. It starts with your own household, and then it goes to your next door neighbors and the people in your own community,
the people across the street that I talk to,
right?
Which we should talk to our neighbors, by the way.
Which then we go to our state, right? We go to the capital. We care about the things and the affairs of those who govern. And
I love Idaho more than other states.
That's right,
and I'm not ashamed of that.
That's right. And yet we love all the other states more than we love the other countries, right? Even
Northern Montana or Canada, whatever you want to call it.
Oh man, you beat me to it. You beat me to it. Yeah, I was just going to do
the Gulf of America,
right? The 51st state.
Yeah. You seen the trend of people going on Google Maps and renaming everything?
No, I haven't.
Oh yeah, the people have been going and reporting, hey, you got the Gulf of Mexico wrong, and they've been renaming it the Gulf of America and telling Google that. Anyway, sorry.
That's funny.
I'm not encouraging that, but I'm not encouraging that. Go ahead.
Well, you've got this element of where in which you are ordered in terms of the way in which you love those closest to you, and it doesn't mean we don't love the peoples of the world, right? It doesn't mean
absolutely
that we don't care for those things, but there's going to be limits, and there's going to be certain jurisdictions that are going to be most proper to the ordering of a particular people that shares. So, for instance, the United States, being a Christian nation, should love being a Christian nation, and that should be distinguished from a Muslim nation.
And it was up until about 100 years ago, really. And really in the last 50 to 60 years is when it really took a side.
For sure.
But that was obvious. So let me ask you a question. When the founding fathers talked about various protections for freedom of religion, et cetera, they were totally talking about mosques and those sorts of things, right?
Not at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
They were talking about freedom within denominational Protestantism or
right.
Christianity in the big umbrella.
So that's circling back a little bit to just where we kind of started, right? The element of a nation having a God of the system,
yeah.
a ordering of laws. What we have happening in our country now, we'll just pick on the Muslims for right now. When you have a competing religion, you have a competing culture, a competing people that have different values, and those values actually serve to undermine and to attack the values of the host nation, if you will. And so when you have police officers in Minneapolis not willing to go into particular areas of the city because of the Muslim population there and the Sharia law that has basically been allowed to reign there.
Right.
That is abomination.
That's chaos.
That's terrible, and that's chaos, and it's destructive. And when you have Congresswomen, Rashida Tlaib and what's the other one? Ilhan Omar.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
These Muslim women.
It's a double judgment on us, honestly.
Well, yeah,
We've got a woman and a foreigner ruling over us.
These people are undermining the values of the country, and so these are this is the problem of multiculturalism, and so they're going to tear down ultimately what the nation is. So therefore, you do have to have a self-identity that you understand what it is.
Yeah.
That's the problem of, well, we're just an idea. We actually don't have any particular values other than the value of we're just an idea, right?
Yeah.
Other than
we've made
democracy.
multiculturalism, we've made this melting pot ideology our our religion, and
the idea of a melting pot. I'm going to stop you there.
I was going to say, since we use that phrase, the original intent of melting pot was fine.
To become one.
Yeah, become
you
one.
You melt together.
Yeah, what's the point of a melting pot? You throw in different metals and they all kind of form together and you actually form a stronger alloy. So yeah, you can have Irish and German and Italian and British, but what did we all have in common? Well, Protestantism, we had a general heritage, we had the same worship, and we all wanted to build America together as Americans.
I love you, and I'm for this. I'm for
Amen.
This project, and I'm for these people.
Yep.
Right. And so I have your back.
You don't throw Islam and Judaism and Hinduism and paganism and Darwinianism. You don't throw all that into the melting pot with Christianity and still get a Christian nation. You get this, honestly, an abomination that'll ultimately just crumble and fall apart like the feet of clay and iron in the Daniel 2 picture.
Well, that's why things start to come apart, right? Because they actually can't all stick together.
Yeah.
And so they don't actually melt together. They end up being, and that's what God told Israel, right? Yeah. You can't assimilate with them and maintain your identity. Yeah. And so ultimately, multiculturalism is the pathway of internal destruction. Mm-hmm. This is how you implode. This is how you self-destruct as a nation. And so therefore, the issue of open borders is welcoming people who are not immigrating. So because we're not against all immigration, the idea is there is a certain way to come to the nation and certain things you need to value and be able to do. Like you need to speak English. Yeah. Right. That should be a priority and all those types of things.
And I have zero problem saying that also if you want to become a citizen of the United States, you need to be a Protestant evangelical, right? Like
yeah, I would agree.
Or at least a worshiper of the triune God.
Welcome on your visitor pass.
Exactly.
You can visit in vacation, and
let me know when your pastor gives me a recommendation.
but if you're just visiting, then you can go home.
Yep.
You will leave, and if I don't want to get ahead of myself. We'll come back to that. But this idea of yes, that we ought to be prioritizing people who are Protestant Christians. That are wanting to be part of our country, and so therefore they need to speak English or need to commit to learning English, and so those types of things. Yep. That's just that's basic. Right?
This really shouldn't be controversial, and the fact that it's so controversial in our modern age is really, I think it's a zeitgeist thing. I mean, it really is just the spirit of our age right now is one that we speak like that, and you sound like you're crazy to a lot of modern people. And this is literally how every nation has governed itself up until about 2 seconds ago. This is genuinely how all cultures have always orchestrated themselves, how they've conducted themselves in history. That doesn't mean there hasn't been allegiances. Like you look at the Roman Empire, they assimilated nations in sort of a different way. They didn't really fully, you didn't become Roman, you didn't become Italian, right? But you did become Roman. They had sort of like a bigger umbrella. And so, there's the concept of empires, and there's some different different things you can look at where we can say that there have been some examples of that. But in general, this is how nations operate. And so the fact that it's controversial today really reflects just a poor understanding and a poor upbringing that I really think sort of the liberal and leftist ideology has impacted our generation. I mean, these are concepts that are natural to us if we just think common sense, and we really have to resist and fight against our own common sense to try to make these arguments. So Obviously, where we're going to get to is, what about my Christian neighbor who's foreign? What about evangelism? Don't we want people? Because that's the argument, honestly, that is so tired to me is, well, don't we want all these people to come in so we can evangelize them? And that, anyway, maybe we can talk about that later. Feel free to address that now if you want, but I've got thoughts on that.
No, I want to come back to that.
Sounds good.
All right, so let's get to the issue though of immigration. Why do so many people want unfettered, or why are they satisfied and happy to have all of these immigrants coming from, face it, third world countries primarily, or enemies of the United States? What are some of the motivations and reasons for having all of these immigrants come to our country?
I'll give you two: slave labor, and they vote Democrat. There's my two.
Okay, I'll add a third.
Going.
I'll add a third. I think those are true. I'll add another one, and this goes to Pat Buchanan's book, The Death of the West. 2002 is the book. I read it a long time ago, and a lot of it is the issue of we're not replacing ourselves. Yeah. We're not having enough children.
We're not having children.
We're not having children. So here's the thing. There's a lot of economics involved in it as well. But part of a nation and part of a people is maintaining. If you want to maintain your nation, if you want to maintain your culture, then you actually have to value it enough to raise the next generation in it, and you have to value that next generation. You actually have to, if you want to exist, or if you want your children to exist in this country, you actually have to have babies. Mm-hmm. And one of the elements in that Pat Buchanan does a really good job talking about, not just in The Death of the West, he's not talking about America exclusively. He actually points to a lot of the death of Western civilization in Europe, and it's the issue of
we're following the trajectory.
It's the issue of modernism, feminism, and a number of different aspects of that, wherein people now are choosing not to have children. They actually have lost sight of their nation, their heritage, the future, and they've become very self-absorbed. And so life is about me and my convenience and my comforts. And it's not really building. You have to continue to build a nation, because if you don't continue to build it, you actually just by factor of not building, it actually crumbles and goes out of existence, unless you have immigration. We'll talk about what that means. But this issue of not having enough children is a big issue. So if you don't have enough of your own children, there's an economic there's a significant economic hit that happens.
Well, yeah, because so you use the word replace, right? So minimally speaking, each family has to have a minimum of 2 children just to maintain population, right? There's a father and a mother. When they die, they need to have at least 2 children to replace them. Here's the challenge, though. They replace them. There's 2, but what if they're both the same gender, right? It screws up dynamics. So really, if we want to be fruitful and multiply, I mean, sort of the idea there is that we need to be having 3 or more children to actually grow a population. And when you take into account that some of those kids may die young, or they may not make it to maturity and have their own children, minimally speaking, if we want to take this back a second, birth control and no-fault divorce are so much to blame in destroying our culture, because we have ultimately quit having children, quit catechizing children, quit raising children, and then we import other people's children to solve the problem, which then means we're also importing their gods, their values, their cultures, and it's self-destructive.
So here is, I'll quote a couple of quotes here from Pat Buchanan's Death of the West on page 99. How much will it take to convince a woman to have 4 children? People are concerned about their appearances, their education, their careers. And then another sentence on the same page. European women have decided they want 1 or 2 children or none. And they have the means, contraception, sterilization, and abortion, to affect these choices. And European women consider these personal desires to be far more compelling than demographic studies describing what Europe will look like when they are 70 or 80 or gone. Yeah. And so if you, so that's another element of having children. If you don't have children or enough children, who's going to be taking care of you? One, economically, just providing, but also just in the care and so forth.
And who's going to learn your trade? Who's going to learn the skills that you have? Like who are you passing that on to? Immigrants? That's a tall order.
Well, yeah, and that opens up another can there. We should probably get into that too. But this issue of I
have a feeling this is gonna be a big one.
Yeah, we're an hour in, but it's okay. We're gonna keep going. Because they're having fun. They're enjoying it. This is what they signed up for.
And if not, we are. So we're going to keep going.
Exactly. So you said the 2 things you said were what?
So slave labor, right? So
Cheap
what's
labor.
the argument right now? Well, who's going to pick my blueberries or whatever? Like insert whatever agricultural reference you want there. Yeah. So I mean, we basically have an artificial serfdom, right? We have a sort of a cheap. I think it's interesting that for the culture that doesn't want to talk about American slavery, we're completely content with sort of a modern implication of that. Whether it's slavery that we've used in China or slavery that we've imported from south of the border. Cheap labor, sort of just an over greed ultimately. And then also most of these people, because they are draining our benefits, right? So, hospital benefits, welfare benefits, a lot of these illegal immigrants have been ultimately able to come because they see economic prosperity, they see abundance, they then become that. Well, naturally, that means they're going to want to vote left. If they have the ability to vote, whether they achieve that legally or illegally, that's a whole other discussion. They're going to vote left typically, right? So that's a huge motivating fact.
If you receive handouts, you're going to vote for the handout.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the whole
regardless of what strings come with it, because you don't care. Because at the end of the day, we're the ones who end up footing the bill, not the people who are taking advantage of it.
And this goes into all kinds of different issues. I mean, this is a really systemic issue with taxation, which is a lot of legal plunder, a lot of these elements where why can businesses not afford to pay their workers so much? Well, because they're paying so much in taxes and a number of different all the regulations and all the problems that they have. So there's a number of different factors.
Yeah, instead of hiring their neighbor next door for a wage that is comparable to their own, so that they can grow and build this thing, because part of it too is this myth of zero sum game, right? We have this idea that if I actually pay livable wages and want to grow other people's households, that somehow that's going to take away from my profitability. When the irony of that is that you get better employees when you actually pay them well, when you invest in their life, when you're neighbors and you have a common investment in your well-being is my well-being. That's a completely different dynamic than when you just have sort of the nameless people that don't even speak your language that you're just going to use, abuse, and if you lose them, oh well, you'll replace them. That's a very different culture that we've built that actually is contrary to the American Protestantism that you described earlier. It's actually very counterproductive to even our own value system.
And listen, there is a problem in our country, and this is part of the death of the West. There is a losing and a regressing from a Protestant work ethic when you have a whole generation who are spoiled and medicated. They're drugged up. Yep. They are. We do have. Look, there is a problem when all you have is cultural Christianity. It will degrade and it will disintegrate into a blasé nation wherein you actually have certain things that you have lived with and have grown up with, but you actually don't know why, and then you don't care, and then you actually lose meaning and purpose, and so then you get a bunch of basement dwellers and couch sitters and dole, happy to be on the dole, and married to the government, and all kinds of different issues. That's what I mean by this. A lot of tangles, and it's a spider web of problems, a systemic issue, where you've got so many different, all these different elements. When values are eroded, and you lose your identity as a nation,
sure.
Then you absolutely feel like you have to open the floodgates of a fresh group of people who are actually just literally hungry in some ways, right? They're hungry and they're willing to work. And when you go, oh wait, our people aren't willing to work, there is some truth to that. Some of it's actually overblown.
Sure. Yeah, there's people sitting on welfare that should be doing some of these jobs. I could say that.
Look, there's sometimes
welfare is a whole different problem.
There's a situation that I have in mind, and there's a where actually sometimes a young man needs to not have a soft place to land.
Yeah, absolutely.
He actually needs to have the comforts.
Yeah, the pigsty moment.
It's time. Look, you actually can't be that picky. You actually are going to need to figure it out. You're actually going to need to step out, and you actually, if you're hungry, then you're probably going to have to figure something else out. Yeah. And so anyway, getting back to this issue of immigration, we've got hungry people that are, in some regard, are willing to come. You've got a lot of bad actors and so forth, but you have to replace a population that is, you need cheap labor and you need just labor. because of the lack of replacement. So when a people has lost sight of their values, this again is part of the long-term effects of a multiculturalism, wherein a people don't value who they are,
Yep.
when they don't care. And it's actually well, I guess it's just about me, because actually I'm not really connected to my neighbors.
Yeah.
They actually have their own culture and their own stuff, and
Radically individualistic.
we're radically individualistic, divided from one another. We've got way too many subcultures,
Yeah.
and we don't value the broader
'Cause
concept of
it's
culture.
one thing when the immigrants, so let's go back like 100, 150 years, when the majority of immigrants still shared our religion, shared our common values and morals. They may not have had our American heritage. So we can talk about the fact that, just because you come here and get a piece of paper doesn't mean that you're American in the same way that I'm American, right? You might have American citizenship, but it's going to take a couple of generations really to lay down roots.
That's right.
Like we recognize that there is actually wisdom in saying like, hey, maybe citizenship shouldn't be granted for 2 or 3 generations.
Yeah, you don't get to vote for a while.
Exactly. Like
right?
you need to prove that you are here for the long haul and you're not just here to reap the instant gains. I think there's value in that conversation. But there was at least an expectation that we had a Christian foundation. So even when we had people coming in from Germany, France, British, even if they weren't genuinely elect, right? They still were coming with a Christian worldview, a Christian work ethic. And so if those
Wanting
are the
to
people
participate
coming
in it.
right? If those were the people coming in to help with the population issue, that's one thing. The problem is that our sort of death spiral with regards to the birth rate is a modern invention. And it's really a post-World War II invention. And so when you think about that, post-sexual revolution, post all that stuff, well, those aren't the people that we're bringing in now, because the countries that we would maybe even have some sort of affinity with are having the exact same problem we're having, and hence the title "The Death in the West."
Right.
This all happened in Europe before it happened here, and what's interesting is it's even happening in the East. You look at like Japan; they are at a crisis because they have all these elderly people and no children to take care of them.
That's right.
I mean, we're about to watch an implosion within Japanese culture, which is a extremely monoethnic society, right? You could be the most profoundly, you could learn to speak Japanese perfect, and they will treat you like an outsider for life. Like they are profoundly like, we are Japanese and you are not. Like that's their culture.
Are they racist? I thought only whites could be racist. Can Japanese actually be
We're really
racist?
trying to get kicked off of YouTube. All right. No. I mean, that's absurd, right? What does that even mean? They prefer their own people. Okay. But anyway,
Yeah.
that's a whole different thing. But what I'm getting at there is that you even look in the East, they're having that same thing again, because they followed after the same problem, just a different demon. And so they're experiencing it. So yeah, at the end of the day, let's bring it back to Muslims for a second.
I'm glad, because I was about to go there too.
Perfect. So how many children do Muslims have on average?
I think the average is at least 6.
Yeah, okay. And they still practice polygamy in a lot of part of the world. So when you start taking that, which by the way, Christians, we're not supposed to be polygamists. There is a weird movement in Christendom that's like, hey, let's be polygamists too to outpopulate. No. One man.
Who are you talking to?
One man, one woman. Mike Winger
Who are
comes
your
up with
friends?
a video, and then I see like a weird thing, and I'm like, okay, why is Mike Winger talking about polygamy? I don't know. I haven't really looked into it that much. I'm just saying it exists, right? No. But we as Christians should be having lots of children. Now, providentially, we recognize that God doesn't always grant everyone children. Some people will end up having, all sorts of terrible things. But in general, we should not be a people who resist the blessing of children. And so the curse that we are seeing brought upon our nation today goes back to our disobedience, I think, in that question in the first place.
So you want to talk about loving your neighbor?
Yeah, there you go.
Have babies.
Yeah.
That's actually a good way to love your neighbor.
Yep.
But one of the things that Pat Buchanan talks about in his book, and it's actually beginning to flower and fruit now in Europe, and especially I believe France is the main country, that the Muslims are going to, because French families, couples, women are not having babies enough, when they're having maybe 2 or actually they're not even replacing themselves. I think it's 1.2 or something like that. They're not replacing themselves. And then you have all this immigration. Well, now you need labor. Well, who's willing to come? They don't share a border with Mexico, so it's not exactly the Mexicans going there.
Middle East.
So you've got actually you have Muslims coming into France, and you need a labor force. Okay, well, we solved that problem. But one of the things about the Muslims is they got lots of babies, averaging like I didn't make that up. I'm pretty sure that's what he said. It's been a long time since I've read the book, but it's Muslims at that time were averaging 6 kids per household, and it's just a math issue. Once you just start adding things up over a certain period of time by a certain date, without firing a shot, France will be a Muslim nation. They will actually just take over by sheer population of having children. And so that's just an interesting element where France will actually cease to exist and cease to have a French identity. And it will become. It'll just be. They'll go the way of some of the tribes in the Bible that don't exist anymore.
Exactly.
Where it's like we there used to be a group of people called this, but actually they don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
They're gone. Well, that's going to be France, and there very well could be many other countries. And so So you have to recognize that one of the major reasons why countries like ours want immigration is for the sake of the results of feminism. It amounts to death.
Yeah,
right. It's the death of the nation.
Egalitarianism ultimately has destroyed our culture. When we tell women that they're more valuable in contributing to an office than they are to their own household, we've done a disservice. Not just to our sisters, not just to women in our culture. We've devalued something that God made them to do uniquely, that is a blessing, to such a level that so many women who are faithful, who have lots of children, who are building their household and find lots of fulfillment there, still have a weird guilt complex whenever women ask them, well, what do you do, right? The fact that we have women in our culture that are ashamed of the fact that they're homemakers, not privately, but at least publicly, there's a sense of cultural shame for that. Man, what have we done? Like that's absurd. If you think about the grand history of all of humanity, never before, other than the last 100 years, have we ever had societies that would shame a woman for being a woman.
Or out in public with her many children, right? And you get kind of a cockeyed look, or you get some like, wow, you sure are busy, and different stuff like that. Well, instead of, I actually just like to be celebrated and say, well, that's wonderful, good for you. And
every
that's
time
great.
my wife hears, wow, you got your hands full, she's like, yep, full of good things.
Yeah, exactly, right? Lean into that. And so this is a cultural shift, even and significantly within the church.
Yep.
Right, because it's actually actual Christians, actually saved people, have bought into really some of the values of the world and the values of the feminist culture around us, to where this is controversial. What we're talking about here, Gabe, as you probably already know, this is not common fare in evangelicalism.
No. Well, it reminds me of when we did our 2-part on education versus government schooling, right? One of the points we talked about was, if we don't give our children to the leftists, they won't repopulate themselves. So quit sending your kids to government indoctrination centers.
And we'll be a Christian nation again.
And we'll be a Christian nation in like 40 to 80 years. We'll be fine.
Right.
I mean, it comes full circle right here with this concept of immigration. If you don't want to have the sort of the foreign oppression and insurgency, if you will, within your borders, right? If you don't want to have to deal with that sin, rebuke the sin of childlessness and rebuke the sin of sending your children to government indoctrination centers, and the worldview will win itself out. Because as you noted, Jethro down in Kentucky, who, goes to church every once in a while and is kind of a redneck, whatever, is still more culturally a Christian and imbibing the American values.
Or at least American.
Right, in such a way that is going to preserve our nation. Because you know what that guy's not going to do? That guy is not going to walk into anywhere and blow it up, just for the sake of his religion, right? That doesn't mean that we don't have Americans that sin. That doesn't mean we don't have Americans that don't commit crimes. Of course not. But the difference is that we are going to have a society with common values and love of neighbor, right? There's not that hatred of you're different than me. And what we've allowed to happen is we take in a group of people. Not all of them are evil, obviously, right? That was sort of the big thing after 9/11 is there was some people that were obviously overcompensating in some of the reactions. I recognize that not every individual person is guilty of a particular sin, right? That's fine. But in general, I can also give the umbrella comment that your religion is one that is antagonistic to mine. And that's just facts. That's just truth. And so if we tolerate its existence right beside us, we're going to have continued, conflict like what we're seeing in Europe. I mean, predominantly what you're talking about in France, I mean, it is ultimately the sort of the caliphate taking over of Europe all over again, except for this time they did it sort of from within. Instead of taking it with the sword for Allah,
non-violently.
yeah, they took it from within in sort of a subversive way. And that really should be alarming. If you know history and you see what's happening in Europe right now. I mean, my kids, earlier today at the dinner table, we were talking about sort of adjacent ideas, but one of my kids brought up, like, could you imagine if the people that lived during the Protestant Reformation were alive today and saw what's become of their nations? They're like, they'd probably flip out. Like, to
Where
see
did this go wrong?
Why are there Muslims like walking around our streets, demanding that we pay homage to them? Like, and again, people might hear this and be like, wow, you seem really like, racist or misogynistic, or yes, I hate all women. I hate all other people that are different than me. No, but I can recognize that another culture that is harmful to my neighbor is one that should be resisted. And it's actually my love of neighbor that propels that. That doesn't mean that I have individual hatred for these people. I want to see them saved, right? I want to see them converted. I would love to have these people be the ones that tear down their own mosques, right? And build churches instead. Absolutely. But I also recognize that that's not where everyone's going to end up. I mean, providentially, they're going to bow the knee to Christ one day or another. It's either going to be through the gospel, or ultimately it's going to be through their own destruction. And I pray to God that people can, I guess, wake up to this reality sooner rather than later, because otherwise we're going to see our own culture destroyed in God's judgment on us for our unfaithfulness.
So what about, well, I guess two things. We got a lot.
That was loaded.
We have another hour. So there was a big kerfuffle right before the inauguration. I think there was. Yeah, it was. I think it was actually right around Christmas. It was Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy talking about H-1B and the H-1B
we need
visas.
them clearly.
Well, there was. It started a little bit of a ruckus because it really brought up this issue of immigration and the fact that you're just going to import a bunch of workers really from foreign countries with foreign gods and all that kind of stuff, where they're not Americans, but they're just cogs in the machine, the economic machine, to make us all rich. But the element of, wait a minute, but we are a nation and a people. The reality of what we just talked about is, look, if you do deport a bunch of people and then you also close the border, you are going to face realities of, especially when you have to improve culture as well to get the people who have left the workforce back into the workforce. Yeah. But you do face some challenges. Yeah. And so you don't just create a workforce. It takes arguably somewhere around 18 years or more, or 22 years.
So because it's going to be hard, we shouldn't try.
No, not at all.
Okay.
But you do have to recognize that there is value in having labor come in from a foreign country, especially when you don't have the labor yourself. But you do so on the basis of orderliness. You do so on the basis of legality. You do so with the expectation that they would leave and that they would go home. You treat them well. You don't treat them like slaves, but ultimately they come as visitors, and they don't get to just get free rides on everything.
You're talking about like temporary work visas.
Of course. And so that's
a very different thing than a permanent green card. I'm going to stay here. And,
well, you're brilliant, and you were whatever. You're an engineer, so you get to be here. Whatever.
Strangely enough, there's a lot of American engineers that are working at Starbucks. Moving on.
But you've got this. Yeah, you just have this issue. So you do have to deal with the issue of labor, but you have to establish your identity and your laws that govern it and regulate it in a way. Just like J.D. Vance said the other day, just because we're a nation that was built in many respects from people who came from different places doesn't mean we have to have the dumbest immigration laws 240 years later. Like that's not required just because immigration happened. So legal immigration can be restored in certain ways. Sure. And then again, you start to think about priorities. Who do you count as first in line, sort of thing. Yeah. And then you deal with issues of temporariness.
Off limits.
Then you deal with things of delayed citizenship or voting, right? You don't get to vote for 10 years. I heard some arguments. There were some biblical arguments for that in Scripture. But you've got a number of different elements where you can be wise about how you deal with the workforce, the labor force.
Yeah.
You can also recognize that, oh, wait a minute, we sought to grow in a way that was irresponsible and was part of a system that was against itself ultimately. And so there may be a measure of some economic shrinkage, which is not ideal, but you've got to ultimately get a sense of what it means to be a nation and how you preserve it and then how you properly grow it and protect yourself.
And we can get to it, maybe after we hit a little bit more of why deportation is not an issue, or at least doesn't need to be an issue. I guess it's definitely not a sin. But I mean, one question I would be curious to get your take on is sort of the idea of, shutting down the borders. I think I don't know if it was Stephen Wolfe or someone, essentially proposed, we need to essentially shut the borders down for like 100 years, couple generations, really reestablish. I'm not necessarily saying that that's a must be, but I kind of understand what the argument there is that we don't have a common Christian heritage. So part of what we're looking at is, and maybe that's a whole different episode. We can talk about what does it look like to rebuild Christendom and what is sort of the American, how do we rebuild an American heritage that is truly that? But that is a question I've gotten from some of the men in my church is, well, what do you think about the closed border concept for a period of time?
Well, I think there's legitimacy to that. Just like I was saying, I think the issue is you do have to figure out labor force, and again, if you change the culture enough to where you're going to
are you going to argue for an incremental approach?
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
We're not dealing with murder.
Righteous increments.
Well,
right?
if we're not dealing with murder, then some things you're going to have to take a little bit of a time, especially since you don't just create a workforce as soon as they come out of the womb, right?
Right.
So it takes time. So when it comes to
and then you can talk about like incentivizing Americans to actually learn trades, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, even I remember, I think it was in the book, or maybe it was a news item. Again, this stuff has been. It's so funny to me.
History repeats itself.
Yeah,
right?
no kidding. It's so funny to me that we're having these serious conversations because these were serious conversations like 20 plus years ago, 30 years ago. But anyway, you've got what I was getting at is that I want to say it was Putin or maybe the prior administration or whatever, but I'm pretty sure it was a program in Russia where they actually gave, if you will, tax credits or gave money to families to have babies.
Oh yeah.
Right? Like they actually had holidays.
If you have 4 or more children, you are you don't pay income tax, you don't pay homeowners tax, various things like that.
There were significant incentives, right? Because they saw that their population, their nation was going to die if they didn't do that.
Or
so
even
they tried
China
to
removing the one-child rule, similar concept.
Anyway, getting back to your question, I think the issue of closing the border, look, forever and ever, amen, the border should be closed to people who jump it.
Yes.
You should protect the border
Right.
from illegal aliens. So,
that's agreed.
That's just common. Well, if you're talking about
immigration
and legal immigration, I would be satisfied with temporary immigration. So temporary, you could say you get to come for 2 years, and then at 2 years, like you leave. And then you get a new group. Now you could do something like that. I'm happy,
at least until we've satisfied labor.
I'd be satisfied with different discussions about what the right best policy is to try to say if you wanted to if someone says 100 years that's fine. I actually would have no problem with that. But I do think you have to deal with the issue of it takes a while.
There's a lot of rebuilding to do. There's a lot of rebuilding to do.
Yeah.
So if you just shut it down, it's like we have who we have. I mean, maybe all the leftists that have been threatening to go to Canada would, and maybe it would just solve itself. I don't know.
I heard. Look, I actually saw a video today from the somewhat local guy from the head of Owyhee Produce, and he said, and he was talking about the issue of immigration. He goes, if you deport 30 million people, you are not going to eat. That is just and I don't know how. I mean, it's a little bit of scare tactics, perhaps. I mean, that's the argument of look. The fact is, we've integrated a system of illegal immigration where the majority of your dairy workers are undocumented.
So you need to have a plan in place to fix it.
So you got to have some sort of system where it's like, okay, it's going to take some time, and so I don't have a problem with people coming in legally and for a temporary basis, but you don't make them citizens. And I just had a thought come in because of the news and stuff. Birthright citizenship.
Yeah.
Right. This is a big issue.
Yep.
That was never intended for you to jump across the border, drop a baby, and be like, "Oh, they're a citizen, wonderful." But you weren't a citizen, right? They're actually doing it to where if you are
That's
the way
not what jurisdiction means.
a
right?
non-citizen has a baby within our borders, and they're automatic, and that because they're born here makes them a citizen. No, that doesn't make any sense at all.
It's like when people are like when a baby's born on an airplane over international waters, you get to pick your country. No, that's absurd. You belong to whatever country your family just came from. Like I don't know why this is controversial.
The country that you are a citizen of,
Correct.
right? Because so it just points to the idea of a nation. Let's go to a church, right? You talked about a nation is built of many nations centered in households.
Correct.
A household is a mini nation, and you identify who your people are, and you are born into a family, into a nation with an identity and a name and so forth. And it's the same thing.
If someone gives birth in my house, that child does not belong to me. Just throwing that out there. If that
Right? Yeah. If a stranger,
if that person is not my wife,
broke the window and crawled into one of the bedrooms and had a baby,
you are
that's like,
now a render. Congratulations, you were born in my border.
That's absurd, Gabe. But that actually points. That's the point of it.
That's
right?
the point, though.
The absurdity of it all, and so this element of the family that you belong to, the nation that you belong to, just because you're visiting a nation doesn't then grant you. Just because you were born in Israel doesn't make you a Jew.
Yeah, well, yeah, no joke.
It doesn't make you one. So this whole idea of that you're born here, then you're automatically a citizen, that I think it's 100% right to get this corrected and because that's one of the elements of why people come here is because you get all of the benefits, all of the gravy train of the United States, and we deal with all the gravy train issues, but all the entitlements.
Yeah.
But just because you cross the border and have a baby here, that baby's a citizen, and because the baby is a citizen and they can't take care of himself, now you get to stay for this extended period of time or indefinite, maybe forever. And then all of a sudden, you're a dreamer and all these other different things.
Yeah, it's
ridiculous.
Yeah. So, and obviously, Christian, the average Christian's alarms probably going off in their mind. Well, where's your compassion? Where's your kindness towards this? It's like, okay, obviously, if some lady is fleeing the cartel, crosses the border, she dies, and she has a child left here, like we have a responsibility to care for that child, but we don't have a responsibility to care for that child permanently. And so there's a difference between saying, like, take the parable of the Good Samaritan. There's a difference between
in that strange situation, you could be like, you know what, we will go ahead and adopt you.
Sure, right. Okay. We have the right to do that.
That's right.
We can, but we're not obligated,
That's
right? It's sort of like the parable of the Good Samaritan. The guy stopped because he wanted to obey the 10 Commandments, and he saw someone in need, and he cared for their need, and he made sure that they were brought back to health, right? He didn't adopt them and then provide for him the rest of his life, right? There was a temporary status to that arrangement. In the same way, obviously, if I see someone literally starving on the street in front of me, not like the fake panhandlers.
Doesn't matter where they're from.
Right, exactly. Like, I don't care. Like, I'm going to love my enemy, even if they're clearly like Middle Eastern and wearing the whole, get up, and I see them get hit by a car, I'm going to stop and I'm going to care for them. But I'm not obligated to care for them permanently. I'm going to make sure they get put into the right place so that they can have continued care. So in those situations, I would say as Americans, we have an obligation to care for the needs of that now orphan. And then maybe that might be going through an adoption process, right? I mean, that's a whole other thing. We need to get rid of government adoption agencies and bring adoption back to the church, but that's a whole other thing. There may be an appropriate expression where as a country, we can have mercy upon this child and raise them as our own. Or minimally, we need to be in contact with the nation of origin and make sure that that nation takes responsibility for the child to care for their needs. We're not just going to leave the child to die in the gutter, right? There is Christian compassion there. The question is, where does the compassion lead to? There's no obligation that we need to absorb the entire world's population. I mean, it's just, it doesn't follow, right? It's a non sequitur. It really just logically does not follow that we must do this.
You said it earlier, and I think it was a great illustration. When someone is visiting your home, they do not, by virtue of visiting your home, become a render.
Right.
It just doesn't work that way.
I can show them hospitality.
And so people who visit here, and if they're outsiders, they're non-citizens, illegals, whatever you want to call them.
Sure.
They are, you could say they're visiting here, and so you treat them with kindness, you treat them well, and so forth, in terms of the way your interpersonal relationships and loving your neighbor. But the issue of their criminality, the issue of what they've done, is it's still an issue, and they should be sent back. Now, you had sent me a question.
Yes,
I think it came from probably someone in your church. So let's consider maybe you've got someone who is undocumented, as they are now called. And
so you have people that have criminally entered the country, just to clarify that.
Yeah, but by the way, I love the way our new press secretary just restores some sanity. By the way, culturally Christian in terms of wearing a cross around her neck, being very overt and upfront about that, and then saying actually they're all criminals because they entered our country illegally. Yeah. So that's a great thing. Anyways, this person you've developed a relationship with, maybe they're your neighbor, and you evangelize them, and they come to faith, and they come to your church, and then come to find out, it turns out that they are undocumented, and then now they're being deported, or they're being threatened to be deported. So that they're actually going to be rounded up and shipped off. What do you do as the church? Do you protect them? Do you hide them? Do you resist the government and say, wait a minute, they're now a Protestant. They're now this
is my brother.
This is my brother. You should.
Does our spiritual affection trump in those cases our civil obligations?
Correct. So are you hiding them in your church and allowing them to stay, and resisting the government authority to when they come knocking? Are you saying you won't help them, or how does that work?
Yeah, so I'll preface and say that there is times as Christians to resist unlawful decrees and tyranny of the government. There would be a time for the church to harbor what someone might call a criminal, right? Hypothetically, that could be a real situation. This, however, isn't that situation. And so I think actually the Christians that are saying we're going to be safe sanctuary churches, we'll hide you, we'll do that. They're actually sinning. They're participating in crime, and they're aiding and abetting, which at the end of the day is sinful. So I think we in no way can be defending that. Again, can there be an extreme weird one-off case where this child but even then it's like we have an obligation of Christians to say, well, I have this orphan child and I know that their parents are undocumented. We have an obligation then to make sure that we are upfront and honest, and then try
with
to
the governing
care.
Authorities.
Exactly.
And you make your appeals.
Correct. We're not trying to enforce a nanny state. I don't think we need to, obviously the way it was phrased, I think there was a viral clip that went around that probably is what this question is pertaining to. There was a viral clip where there was this pastor talking about, well, we don't want raids coming to our churches. Obviously, I don't want someone knocking on my door in the middle of the government has no right to do that. Do they want to wait patiently outside and then deal with that? That's different, right? But for us to say that as Christians, we should be harboring essentially fugitives of the law, that we don't have any biblical precedent to say that this is an unjust action that the government's taking. Yeah, no, I don't think we can. I think it'd be wrong for us to do so. And churches that are participating in that, I think, need to really analyze their biblical convictions, because they need to repent.
Well, those same churches, there's a hypocrisy. By the way, 100% correct. I'm in agreement with you that even Christians within churches who have illegal citizens illegal aliens within their congregations, those people are subject to the laws of the country and are subject to being deported. And listen, these same evangelifish pastors and church leaders, they are the same ones who would, of course, identify that if you have a man who has beaten his wife in your church, or abusing a child in the church,
sanctuary.
What are are they going to protect them from the cops?
Well, a lot of these same churches,
they'd say call the police.
They like to protect pedophiles, so maybe, I don't know.
Well, okay,
but yes, your illustration, absolutely, yes. It's absurd if you insert any other crime.
Any other crime. Okay. Oh yeah. Well, of course, they've actually hurt another human being. This other person, this illegal alien, hasn't hurt another person. Okay, let's go with stealing a car.
Sure.
They've stolen a car, but they're a Christian now and they've repented. Again, repentance doesn't remove the issue of legality, the
Correct.
issue of of dealing with the laws and the consequences of those laws.
Repentance includes rectifying the wrong, which means also submitting yourself to a proper punishment.
So, in that particular case, should they be subject to deportation? That Christian now is to be perhaps the best missionary that they can be to the place in God's timing, providence, and so forth. They are now to go back to their people and their country to seek to pursue the best that they possibly can. But this is part of the consequence of their sin. And just because you're a Christian now doesn't mean that the law doesn't apply to you.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where, it's not assuming that there is legal avenues for immigration, right? There's nothing to say that, you need to do this properly. Because I will admit that there probably are some people who, obviously I wouldn't say they know that they think they're doing right. Like there are people that maybe cross the border and they're trying to escape some horrible situation. There are those situations. That's for sure. And they may not be trying to do necessarily wrong. They it's out of desperation. But those people, at that point, you need to still be counseling them. You need to turn yourself in and try to pursue this in a legal way. Go back to your country and then pursue it in the legal way. And you can try to give them resources, right? That
we can help them seek mercy.
Right.
Like there's nothing wrong with that. And they keep trying to give the sob story, especially primarily the left. Well, what about the asylum seekers?
Photos.
Well, there's a process for asylum seekers.
Correct.
You can receive asylum. We actually are very good at being compassionate and providing asylum to those who are being politically or religiously persecuted.
On that note, can we point out, though, that the purpose of asylum is supposed to be, one, temporary, and two, it's not to just drop them off in some random town where they end up becoming the predominant population of that town. That's absurd. So I don't know what's gone on with our asylum program in our country, but political refugees, religious refugees, things like this, we have gone totally haywire, where we have people that have entered our nation legally, even and through some of these programs, that are just lost and we don't know where they're at. So yeah, there's a lot of issues going on, which I think goes back to the beginning of this conversation, is that we need to actually have a foundation and a framework that we're trying to build. And that if we don't have that framework of where we're trying to go, we're going to set ourselves up for a lot more pain.
Well, we've turned ourselves into a nation that becomes the one who solves all the world's problems,
right?
And they do so at the as if they are a church or different other things. And the problem is you've just watered down and diluted the identity of our own nation, and you just welcome all of these people from all over the world, all over different elements, and you just be like, okay, well, now you come here, we're going to give you this, we're going to give you that, and okay, now you can just be, you don't need to be a citizen, you don't need to assimilate, and you can be here forever. It's a problem.
Well, and go back to what you said a minute ago. Well, they didn't do anything wrong. They're not harming anyone. Yeah, actually they are. They are, because they're taking away resources, funding, money, things that are intended to actually build up your neighbor.
Housing.
Right. So at the end of the day, actually talk about housing.
Yeah.
Let's think about Idaho, right? Let's say that throw out whatever number you want, a couple 100,000, 30,000. I've heard a range of numbers of illegal aliens in our state. You think about how many households are represented, and you look
refugees.
Exactly, right? And you look at the housing crisis in Idaho. I mean, if you want to, it's inflammatory language, but it's accurate. Right now, I can't believe what it costs to rent a 1-bedroom apartment.
I looked it up today. It's about $1,300.
Yeah, there are people paying what I pay for my mortgage with 7 acres for an apartment. Like, it's crazy to me. And you can't find them. They can't build them fast enough, right? Well, what happens when you remove a whole bunch
subsidized.
Of people? Yeah, well,
right.
So
for the refugees.
Exactly. So they're government funded, which means they're taxpayer funded, which means you funded it.
Mm-hmm.
I funded it. We all funded it. So when you take all that into account,
isn't that compassionate?
Well, right. What's more compassionate is making sure that my sons have a future career. What's more compassionate is making sure that the people who have been here, who have died for our country, who have bled and sweat and poured their life into the land, that those people have the resources. What's not compassionate is watching little grandma Ethel, who's owned her family farm for 100 years, who now has to leave her family farm because she can't even afford the taxes. Right? That's unjust.
That's right.
And we need to repent of that as a state.
It's legal plunder. It's socialism, wherein you are going going to take from some and you're going to redistribute to others who you deem more worthy.
Well, and that's actually how conservative states become left, ultimately, is that you end up repopulating.
That's right.
Because you get all the people who are actually conservative get run out of their own land, and they ended up, I mean, I don't know if you watch Westerns much, but watched a Western recently, and the whole plot of Magnificent Seven, right? What are they doing? They're coming in and they're plundering basically these people's lands. They're offering them pennies so they can just steal it, right? They're robber barons, right? That's basically what our government has done, and what our cities have done, our state governments have done, is they've become robber barons that'll say, I will give you, pittance for what your land is actually worth. Get out. And then what do? They build 6 houses in its place, and they put in people who are going to vote Democrat, right? I mean, obviously, this is a hyperbolic statement that I'm saying, but functionally, that's what happened to California. Did you guys know that California used to be a conservative state?
In my lifetime.
Yeah, right. That's crazy to some people. People will be like, no, that can't be possible. Yeah, no, it was when I was growing up. And even today, if you go to California, much of the communities are still fairly conservative, especially the agricultural ones, the ones that are tied to the land, that actually have some investment and some sort of heritage generationally in the land. And those people that have stuck it out, man, I feel for them. I feel for them because they are being driven out by the policies of their own lawmakers.
Well, one of the things that we are doing as a church is we actually, the reason why I told you I looked that up earlier, because I also saw that the median home price in the Treasure Valley is $410,000, the median price.
Wow.
So just looked that up today.
I bought my first house for $106,000 in 2010. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah, I won't tell you what I spent on mine. But anyway, inflation's rough. Anyway,
yep, absolutely.
What we're doing is we're actually on February 8th, we're having a men's roundtable in our church, and we are talking politics, economics, and all these things. And one of the things, so this is, if you hear this before February 8th, you'll know one of the topics that I really want us to brainstorm and get into, because I think we need to solve for this. One of the things, I'm going to tie this all into here. One of the things that we're going to talk about is the issue of housing, and considering how we solve for this issue for the sake of our children. Because we've been talking about things like, okay, we want our children to be prepared to marry at younger ages than what is happening now. Okay.
Yep.
Well, when you start getting, this is another cultural element, right? You delay marriage for career, and you enter in all this debt and all these different things. And so then you delay marriage. And so marriages are getting closer to 30 years old.
Yep.
Then
Which,
you have,
again, contributes to the child issue.
okay, you're getting ahead of me again.
Sorry.
But you're nailing it, right? It just naturally means you're going to have fewer children. That's just the math. You've got, but not only that, you delay marriage, and then you get married and you delay children within marriage.
Yep.
Okay, that's the
Which
conventional wisdom.
Biologically, maybe 2 if you're lucky.
Well, hey, oh well. Anyway,
Convenient excuse.
I'm not going to save the West all by myself. So that's sort of the way some people want to think about it. But anyway, you've got, but getting back to this issue of housing, you've got this issue of, okay, we want our young people to be able to be prepared to get married at a younger age, and to start their families, start their careers, and so forth. How are they going to buy a house?
The church is going to buy land, and we're starting new towns. Let's go.
Communes. All right.
Yeah. No, not communes.
Oh, well, I like communes. We can stockpile weapons.
Oh, well, I got enough guys in the church that are doing that on their own. I know exactly where to go if there's ever a zombie apocalypse or a civil war. But,
exactly. Okay. But my point is...
but seriously, land, right?
Well, I get that, but okay. That requires...
For me, it
brainstorming.
Works. I'm going to partition, and I already told my oldest son, I'm like, you can go build your starter house out in my pasture, right? Because that'll be a lot cheaper. Right,
and we have to come up with solutions.
Exactly.
Like that.
This is what we're thinking. I'm glad to hear you're doing this.
We've got to talk about that. We need to come up with creative solutions. We need to be mindful of this, because so another element of this is, as we share these values, as we promote a building of Christian culture, a rebuilding of Christian communities,
Christian
you're going to have to keep your kids together. We have to keep our generations together as much as possible. Again, it's not I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that my children can never move away.
Sure.
They actually are within their rights and their freedom as they begin their own household. They can move anywhere in the world that they want to. They can. That is within their rights. However, we want to create an environment and a value system wherein they desire to remain close to their families because there's the sharing of resources, there's the sharing of values, there's the input of multi-generational elements. You've got the commitments to local churches. You have the commitments to land, identity, people, to say, I love Idaho. I love my people. I love my community.
My sons love Melba. I mean, I live in Melba.
Well, that's kind of weird.
So, no, that's what I'm saying. Like the fact that I'm just trying. I love Idaho. I love Melba. I love where I live. It's beautiful. I got a great view of the Owyhees. But it's also just kind of dirt and weeds. Let's just be honest, right? I can be honest, right? Man, my oldest son, he's like, I want to live like right up the road. I want to be in Melba, so I want to raise my family. And I'm like, I mean, there are other parts of Idaho that are really pretty. And he's like, yeah, no, this is where I'm from, though. I didn't even have to really teach that to him. It was natural for him. What a gift, right? So no, I love exactly what you're talking about. This need for, we need to build a multi-generational love for our land and a heritage. One of the things I thought about is how many people like inherit their family home nowadays and not just turn around and sell it. Right?
Very, very few now.
Because if you think about it, a lot of kids, it's like, oh, mom and pop died. The family home's 3 states away. I'm just going to sell it and use that money to pay off my mortgage here. That's what ends up happening. And so there's no connection. There's no history. And I think that's really been detrimental to our culture.
You're touching on something I've noticed over a number of years. And I noticed this with some people who build businesses and big businesses like dairies and so forth. And one of the things that I was hearing is these dairymen, they create these businesses. It's quite the operation, and they've got their families, and their kids don't want anything to do with it. Their kids they've raised their kids to actually raise their kids to not care and appreciate what has provided for them and the family industry and business. And so they've actually, I want you to go away to go to school, or I want you to be, I want you to just be free to think of something else. And actually, if you want to do that, that's great. And then they get to the point of retirement, or they get to the point of they're ready to pass away, and there's no one that wants it.
So then it gets bought out.
It's the death of the family farm. They get bought out by somebody else. And there is just to me, I find that to be sad, right?
Yeah.
An element of,
it's strange.
Like, there's an opportunity for you to stand on your parents' shoulders, and instead you're choosing to be like, I'm going to start out by myself on my own from scratch. Now you can do that. Like, that's, I'm not saying you can't.
Prerogative, yeah.
It's your prerogative. And there might be good reasons to, but my point is that there is so much more value, I believe, in reaching for a multi-generational heritage, both in land, both in resources, in relationships, and in church.
Right? Building a multi-generational church is vital.
Very much so. And so
and that naturally solves the immigration crisis because it solves the population issue.
And passing on a trade, teaching your sons to take over the family business. That doesn't.
And that's why you have
enough.
lots of kids, because maybe not all of them are going to be gifted or interested.
That's a great point.
One of them will. One of them will.
Hopefully.
Lord willing.
And that's exactly right, because there's going to be different interests. Yeah, if you've got multiple kids, you can have, one person takes over the rest of the business and other people start 10 more businesses, whatever the case may be. I just think that we need to get a greater sense of what we care about, and the getting back to this concept of nation and identity. Who are we? What do we value? Where's our place? Now, that's what Stephen Wolf talks about, the idea of a heritage. Like, this is where my family's from. This is where this is the place where people have died, and this is where they're buried. And we all these different things. I think
you have
really
a connection to the past, right? You know, I mean, so you start talking about like the concept of like a heritage American. So obviously there are some Americans that have been here for a couple generations. There's some Americans that can trace themselves back to, pre-Revolutionary War, to the Mayflower or whatever. I know one side of my family back into the early 1800s, and then it kind of dries up. So I'm not sure how much longer before that. And I know part of my family came, Civil War era. So I mean, I know that at least for the most part, my family has been here for at least 150 years. But some people can say longer, some people can say less. So there is a sense in which we recognize that there are different levels of that history for some people. especially for us that live on the West Coast, like we don't have as many generations. People that grew up on the East Coast, they can trace their history back further, right? Typically speaking, just because that part of the nation is older.
More given to that. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so we recognize that what we're trying to build here is actually rooted also in sort of economics, right? Civil society was built around, trades and mutually benefiting, economic, I guess, trades or businesses, right? So when you build a town, you had the carpenter, you had the blacksmith, you had the doctor, you had the pastor, you had people that all filled their role and they all served one another. That's the basis of community. Part of our challenge, I think, for modern America, especially when we start talking about immigration, is sort of the globalization concept. When we have decentralized our common love for our neighbor, when the person who meets my need doesn't actually live across the street, but is really actually centrally located on the other side of the nation, or maybe even the other side of the world, we've drastically changed the way human society has always worked. And so if you think about that, the next time you go to a business, well, that business might be here local on my street, but where is that business headquarters? Where is the actual money going back to? Who is it actually funding? Is it, is it actually my neighbor, or is it someone on the other side of the planet? Exactly. You got to, right there. You jumped ahead of me for once. So that's exactly it, right? We're actually channeling and funneling money into foreign entities rather than the person across the street. And so one thing I look forward to, and for those of you that are listening from our churches, which is probably the majority of this audience, one thing that I love about partnering with Truth Family is that we both at Stone Mountain and at Truth Family both have a similar desire that we want to build a new Christendom, like the concept of Christian boroughs, as it's been called. We want to build parallel economies. We want to do life together. I hate to use that bus phrase, but we want to live life together as Christians within the Treasure Valley.
It's a little gay, but
Gabe.
No,
oh,
gay.
Nah, fine. It's all right. My boys will laugh at that part. But,
I know what you mean.
But we want to build something together in such a way that we can mutually bless one another, right? So one of the things I love and I look forward to partnering more between our churches in the future is, man, you got guys that build houses at your church. You got a guy who has an HVAC company. You've got guys with various businesses. We've got guys with various businesses. We can serve one another, build one another, invest in one another's well-being, and rebuild. That's actually part of how you rebuild your culture and your civil community, is by keeping this is one thing that I'll say the LDS church does really well, right? They keep all the money within the church. They only go to their own businesses, et cetera, et cetera.
They're really good at it.
Man, we need to do that better. We need to do that better. And we need to actually build good businesses then, right? That's a whole different topic. But immigration wouldn't be an issue if we were actually doing these things. This is the only reason why I bring it up.
Yep, and that'll take time to do that. And that's the thing. It's going to take probably a couple generations.
Let's build.
So, but you got to start. But you got to start with the values. You have to start with the convictions that it's worth doing. If it's just, if everything's just about you and you just get, you cash out your 401k when it's time, and everything is just, hopefully I'm comfortable as I go into the grave. The question is, what are we doing to consider that we are building for the future? Yeah, we're building for the future, and we're looking to the next generation to pick up the baton and to carry it faster and better and further than we do it ourselves.
It's a tragedy if we go to our deathbed saying, well, at least there was peace in my day. I'll let my kids worry about the calamity. That's terrible. We can't do that. I want to build a nation that my children will love to live in. And I want to contribute to that. And I recognize that I might not see it in my lifetime. My sons might not see it in their lifetime. But you know who will? If we are faithful, my grandchildren, my children's children's children, to 1,000 generations or however long before Christ returns, we should be building faithfully. And so that's where I tie this all back to, biblically principled, eschatologically, regardless of what your eschatology is. We want to be the faithful servant who is found working when Christ returns. We don't want to be the lazy sluggard who's been hiding his talent in the ground, waiting to see what would happen. We want to be the one who's been investing and building. Because whether you're on-mill, post-mill, pre-mill, whatever your eschatology is, we want to be found faithful, right? That's right. Whether you think that Christ is going to return in whatever period, that doesn't matter. Do you want to be found as a faithful servant upon his return, or do you want to be found as the one hiding? And so let's build. Right? I lived in Europe for a year as an exchange student. Those cathedrals took hundreds and hundreds of years to build, right? They literally started hanging rocks, knowing they would die before they even saw, a portion of it completed. We need to have that kind of mentality. Right. One of my favorite expressions, I don't know who said it originally, but I think I heard Paul Washer say it, originally for me anyway, was, when's the best time to plant an apple tree? 100 years ago. Well, when's the next best time? Today, right? That needs to be our defining ethos. And if we are actually building and contributing towards that, it doesn't matter if I die without seeing it. I will die with a peace knowing that I've been building towards something. And our children need to be catechized into that worldview.
And you never know. That's the thing. You don't know how fast, how God will work it out. I think about, we were studying Ezra and Nehemiah and the exiles returning, and how long was it going to take? I don't know. I mean, at one point it was like 15 years, and then it's another group comes, and then a Nehemiah is raised up, and then the walls are rebuilt, and then
it could be faster than we expect.
Which that's what they did. The walls went up like it was. They went at least like a decade or more, whatever it was, where the walls are in shambles and they were in bad straits. Things looked really bleak. There were a lot of threats, a lot of problems, and just sort of a malaise. And then here comes Nehemiah. And his leadership, his rallying of the troops. And the next thing you know, the walls are going up fast. Everybody's got their part. Every family does their thing. Even a guy that doesn't have any sons, him and his daughters are out there getting after it and getting it done. And then they're threatened. He's like, okay, we're not stopping. Sword in the trowel together. Yeah. And so you just don't know. And so what you do is you start and you do your best. You seek to be faithful. You have a positive outlook, because if it's good work, then it's it's for the Lord, and so He'll bless that in whatever way He chooses. But I've just been convinced a little bit more recently that we pray too small of prayers, and we have too small.
Amen.
We have too small of an outlook and too short-sighted of an outlook, to where we get used to the hopelessness or to the malaise of a 4-year Biden administration, and you don't know what it's going to look like. Yeah, you don't know what it's going to look like. You could have a Trump where in 2 weeks things are going at really, really fast speeds, and it can be that same way in a lot of different ways as you build Christian boroughs and rebuild Christendom from the rubble, from the ground up.
Well, if you were to ask me, 6 months ago or 6 years ago, that we'd be having this sort of rhetoric and public dialogue that we're having right now, I would have thought you were crazy, right? So the fact that we have the Secretary of Defense that we have, the fact that we have people like J.D. Vance saying, hey, there's such a thing as the Ordo Amoris, and we need to have kids. The fact that those things are happening in the public sphere and generating conversation, man, we need to not be faithless, right? We need to step out in faith, and maybe won't go, as fast as we would hope, but by all means, we certainly can gain ground. One of the favorite hymns of our church is "I Know That My Redeemer Lives," and the sort of the chorus, if you will, the refrain is this: shout on, pray on. We're gaining ground, right? This idea of moving forward, glory, hallelujah. We need to regain a sense of that. Like, I know that my Redeemer lives, and so I'm going to shout, I'm going to move, I'm going to keep going, glory, hallelujah. I want to keep fighting because He's going to provide for me. And we need to take this moment to say, you know what? Shout on, pray on, keep going, glory, hallelujah.
And sometimes it's Artaxerxes that gives you the resources, the motivation that goes. It doesn't require a Christian prince necessarily to get to the point of a Christian prince even. It doesn't require that. It requires faithfulness and taking the opportunity when God provides you mercy, when He provides you a respite from what we deserve. And perhaps the Lord would bless. And we just have this sometimes of a defeatist mentality. We lose down here mentality, and instead we need to be faithful, like you said, and seek to build and seek to do what would honor the Lord, and He'll use it as He pleases. And we just pray that the outcomes would be profitable both for His glory and for the benefit of our generations.
Yeah, absolutely. So to sum up, then.
You want to close?
Oh no, I say close.
Yeah, no, go for it.
I'm just going to if you want to keep going, I'll keep going. That's fine.
No.
But to sort of recap what we're talking about here, immigration, conceptually speaking, has a proper place. It's going to take time to rebuild a proper godly form of immigration, and so at this point, the deportations that are happening are actually God's law being enforced. Right? They are properly, righteously. At least in intent. Now, it's not to say that there might not be evil things that happen in the midst of it, that there might not be tragedy. Some people might ask, well, what are you returning them to? What awaits them? Those sorts of things. Have you no compassion? Obviously, there's different things that need to be worked out. But what we are saying is that immigration, at the end of the day, as Christians, is something that we need to think about from a biblical framework with a desire to love our neighbor well. And if we fail to do that, whatever we land on, whatever our particularities may be within the topic, if we don't start from a biblical framework of, God created nations. So I guess as a closing thought on that, who's worshiping God in the book of Revelation when we see this picture of the heavenly Jerusalem? It's every tongue, every tribe, every nation. So do we think
with borders?
Right. So one thing I want to point out as an encouragement to you all is that I don't think when Christ returns, he's going to return, even me being a post-mill guy, I don't think he's going to return to a homogenous glob where we're one giant nation, right? I think he's going to return and every nation will praise his name. And that means we'll still have distinct cultures, distinct nations. The job of the missionary is not to obliterate the culture, it's to redeem the culture, right? Grace restores nature, right? It rebuilds it to what it should be. And that's a beautiful thing. And so when we come in, that doesn't mean that there aren't certain things that would change, right? If you're walking around, buck naked, that's going to change.
Because that's your culture.
Right, exactly. That's going to change. But that doesn't mean that you have to sing the exact same Western hymns that we sing. You can still have Chinese hymns, right? Exactly. So all that to say, nations are part of God's plan of salvation, is that he will save peoples. He will save nations, and he will call them to worship him. And so as we look to build this, I just want to encourage everyone to obviously to pray for the widow and the orphan and the sojourner, and to care for those who are genuinely being harmed. But that we have an obligation to obey God, to love our neighbor well. And the part of how we love that is by having a nation that seeks to protect its culture and protect the love of God within its borders.
Well, with that, that's all the time that we have for Truth today. We want to thank you for joining us. And until next time, we hope that you will grow in your love and commitment to Christ and his church as we are sanctified in the truth. God's word is truth.